So in this video, I want to talk about my stance on emulation because I'm pretty sure on my YouTube channel, I never actually talked about my stance on emulation. So that's what we're going to be talking about in this video, specifically talking about emulation. Right off the bat, of course, you already know my feelings about emulation when it comes to me specifically. I'm not really a big fan of emulation and I don't use emulation, and in this video I'm going to explain why I do not use emulation when it comes to video games. I'm not trying to do this to look cool or anything like that. I just personally don't like using emulation. I know that there is reasons for emulation and there is good justifiable reasons for using emulation. Like for instance, one of the biggest reasons why you may want to use emulation in the first place is because, well, you may be a speedrunner, and I know a lot of speedrunners have to use emulation to practice certain sections of games because if they have the original hardware and they have the original copy of the game, a lot of games don't have quote-unquote save states, and since you can't use save states without using emulation, it's pretty much a good way to practice speedruns. So there's a good justifiable reason. Another reason is some games are just so expensive that you do end up wanting to play them, and you want to play them so badly you don't want to pay some of the gouging prices that retro games are going for, because some games are just way too expensive and you know you're never going to pay those prices. So that is another reason to play emulation. Or maybe your hardware is getting bad or whatever the case may be, so you end up using emulation anyway. But like I said, there are reasons that people do use emulation, but for me personally, I don't like using emulation, but I do respect people who use emulation, and it is your choice to use emulation if you do decide to use emulation. And I'm not one person to look down on people if you use emulation. If you use emulation, great, I respect your decision, and if you don't use emulation, great, I respect your decision as well. I think gamers should all get along, and you shouldn't hate people for their decision. I know some people are so passionate about video games and they want to be as pure as possible, and they want to be the purest people who only play on real hardware only, that they look down on people who do use emulation. But for me, use whatever you decide to use as long as you're gaming. That's the main point. But anyway, let's get back to it and let's talk about why I don't actually using emulation. And there's a whole bunch of different reasons to why I don't use emulation. The number one reason you may think is not actually the reason I don't like using emulation. You may be sitting here thinking to yourself, one reason is because it's kind of illegal, or it's a gray area about emulation. That is 100% true. It is kind of a gray area. Some people say yes, it's legal to use emulation now. Some people say it's not legal to use emulation. Who really knows in the court of justice if emulation is legal or not legal? Whether you own the physical copy, whether you not own the physical copy, who really knows if emulation is legal or not? But what I will say is that's not the reason why I don't use emulation, because honestly, I'm not scared to use emulators, and I'm pretty sure most people will never get caught when they use emulators, and I'm one of those people too that I can admit I've used emulators in the past. Who really has not used an emulator? Because when you're downloading these games, it's not like the company's getting paid anyway, because these games are so old. They're not making money off these intellectual properties anyway that are like 20 or 30 years old for some of these games. So it's like it's not really a big deal. And the fact that they're so old, most likely the company's not going to go after you. But for me, that's not the reason why I don't use emulation. If I was going to use emulation and I thoroughly enjoyed it, I would continue on using emulation. But another reason why, or my first reason why I don't like using emulation, is the fact that when I use emulation, I don't feel right about actually playing the game on said hardware. Most of the time, I do like playing on real hardware only, and it's not just for the experience actually, and it's not even the fact that games will most likely play the way they were meant to play. I know that's a big reason for a lot of people to not play emulators, because you won't get that same representation of the game being played on the original hardware. You'll have a whole bunch of technical issues a lot of the time. Maybe the sound will be off, maybe you'll get frame rate skips, maybe you'll get some bad things when it comes to the actual experience overall. Your experience is always going to be best on the original hardware, but that's not necessarily me, because usually when it boils down to a lot of these old games, depending on what system, most of the time nowadays, there's very little handle problems with most emulators, especially for instance if you're playing something like an NES game, an SNES game, a Sega Genesis game. Most of the time if you're playing a lot of these old emulators and a lot of these old games, most of these emulators for the very old games can handle the game pretty well, to where you're not even going to notice if there is a problem with the game. And it will vary from game to game, but for the most part, most games nowadays when it comes to emulation is not that bad, and you're most likely not going to care about the experience, at least from a casual gamer, or maybe not from a purist standpoint or a collector standpoint. If you don't really collect video games like me, myself included, it's not really a big deal. Most of the time, even if there is problems with the game, as long as they're not too bad, and even if the frame rate dips a little bit and it's still pretty playable and a pretty good experience, I don't really care. I just don't like the fact that I'm not playing on the real hardware with like the actual controller that the game was meant to be played on. For some reason, it just feels super weird for me to sit down in front of like a phone, because I know a lot of phones nowadays, especially if you're on the Android side, can actually play emulators, or if you're on a PC, you can play emulators, of course. But for me, I don't like using keyboard and mouse. I don't like using a third-party controller. I don't like using, like, for instance, an Xbox 360 controller to play old NES games. It just feels super wrong to me, and it doesn't feel right because the controller is just so weird. I feel like I'm actually playing another system, if that makes sense. So that's a big reason to why I don't play emulation. I do know for a factor when it comes to emulation on PC, you can actually buy the original controller that plugs in through USB. They make replicas, and a lot of these replicas are super spot on. Like, you can get a Super Nintendo USB controller, a Sega Genesis USB controller, an N64 USB controller. So you can buy controllers that do mimic the real experience you would get on the console. But for me, I just don't like booting up my PC. I don't like having to worry about trying to figure out if the emulator is going to work, trying to map the buttons, because a lot of times it's kind of hard to get these emulators up and running. It's not just due to the fact that I don't like playing on that hardware. Also, it's due to the fact that I don't like trying to set this up. Even though I am pretty smart, there is so many emulators out there, and so many button configurations, and so many game pads, and so many keyboards and things like that. Sometimes it can just be a very bad hassle to get these things up and running, and a lot of times I just don't like the way the game looks on these emulators. Do I play these games in full screen? Do I play these games in a small box? Yada yada yada. So that's another reason why I do not like emulation. And who really knows what emulator is the best to use, because most likely most systems out there have 3 or 4 or 5 emulators for each system, so it's really hard to choose which emulator, or which emulator you're supposed to play your ROMs on, because there's just too many emulators and too many types of systems that it's really hard to find the right one that does work for the game, and you never truly know if you're playing on the best one that's supposed to be suited for that system as well. So that's like always in the back of my mind as well. Am I playing on the best possible settings possible for this emulator? Do I have the best specs on my computer? Things like that. So you have to take that all into consideration when it comes to emulation, and for me, I just don't like that experience. And then another big reason I do not like emulation is the fact that you have everything at your fingertips, and I don't like being that guy who has everything at their fingertips. It doesn't even boil down to being illegal or legal or a whole gray area about that. I just don't like having everything at my fingertips. Fun fact, I think I've only beaten one game on an emulator way back in the day, but for the most part, I cannot finish an emulated game. Most of the time, I do end up trying to play these games on emulators and trying to give emulators a chance, but usually what happens is when I give emulators a chance, most likely most of the time I end up playing these games for 5 or 10, 15 minutes and then put the game down and just never come back to the game, because it just feels really weird to just download a game instantly, play the game. I guess it also has to come back to that attachment to the game. I don't have any attachment to the game since I didn't pay my hard-earned money for the game, and since I didn't pay any money for the game, I think that's the reason I can't play the game. It's not even to do again with illegal, the fact that I illegally downloaded. It's just the fact that it feels super wrong, because like I said, I have all of these games at my disposal. I think it's just due to the fact that I can switch games whenever I want, and since I can switch games whenever I want, so for instance, I download a Sega Genesis game, I play the Sega Genesis game, it's like, well, why play the whole game when I can just move on to another game, since I have all the games for that one system at my fingertips? So that's why I cannot do it, and it's always in the back of my head ever since I've tried to like emulation. That's been a thing, because I download a game and then just move on. Basically what it boils down to is I have too many options, and that's something I like when it comes to actually owning a system and buying the games outright. You don't have everything at your fingertips, and you don't have to worry about trying to have so many games. You can just switch games and you don't feel like you have to finish your game or whatever the case may be. I'm That's why I do like that. I actually like not owning every game. And if I did own every game for a system, it would be different because I paid my hard-earned money for every single game that I bought, and so it wouldn't be so weird to have every game at my fingertips because I paid them. Just knowing I didn't pay them and I can switch games and have all the games at my fingertips just feels wrong to me. And that's really one of the biggest caveats I have with emulation. And that's something I think as a person and as a gamer and as a retro fan of some sorts, I don't think I'll truly ever get over the fact that I have everything at my fingertips. And that's the biggest reason why I don't think I'll ever be able to fully enjoy emulators like other people out there. I wish I can get through that obstacle, but that's an obstacle that I severely suffer from. And then the last thing that really does screw me up when it comes to emulation specifically is the fact that I never know what piece of hardware do I want to play emulation on. Like, for instance, do I want to play emulation on my PC, or do I want to play emulation on other devices? Because you can play them on hacked consoles, you can play them on PCs, you can play them on tablets, you can play them on a number of different devices, and I truly never know what experience I truly do want when it comes to emulation. And it's really hard for me to pick a console or a PC that I want to emulate on because there's just too many options when it comes to emulation all around. So that's another thing I have when it comes to emulation. I just do not know because there's too many options. So I think that pretty much wraps up this video of why I do not emulate and why I do not like emulation. It has nothing to do with the legal rights to all this. It has nothing to do with me being a purist. I just named all the reasons to why I don't normally like emulation. But like I said again earlier in the video, I do respect people's decisions. If you like emulation, great, I respect your decision. And if you don't like emulation, great, I respect your decision as well, because we're all gamers at the end of the day, and as long as you're enjoying your video game, who really cares what? But I wish I was that person that could enjoy emulation a lot more, because there is, like I said, benefits to owning or using emulation, but for me it's just not for me, and I wish emulation was for me. But there you guys go. Now you guys know why I don't like emulation as much as I do. Anyway guys, this is Wayne from My Tech News, signing out.